The next aspect of the perceptions of China and also the history of China and the world that I would like to discuss is the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And I say acts here because I really mean that all countries that were white, predominantly white, settler colonial countries in the Pacific Rim, which means Canada, the United States, and New Zealand and Australia, all passed some form of Chinese exclusion at precisely the same time. Of course, all of this was motivated by anti-Chinese racism, and we'll begin to unpack that a little bit more. In the case of the United States, I would point to the broader phenomenon of the glorification of homesteading, the westward ho movement, and the notion of American progress, as well as manifest destiny to the West, the travel to the West. Of course, this involved the genocide of First Nations and indigenous peoples of the Americas, although First Nations survive through the present, of course, but there was a series of genocidal actions. This also involved the California Gold Rush, which began from a gold find at Sutter's Mill in Sutter's Fort outside of what is now Sacramento, in the base of the Sierra Nevada hills in what is now the state of California. It was previously part of Mexico. The Homestead Acts and Mining Acts of 1872 basically allowed homesteaders to abuse these acts to appropriate massive sums of land and combine them together. In popular culture, the books Little House on the Prairie is sort of a series here, contributed to the glorification of so-called sodbusters and pioneer wives. But the gold rush and the Wild West lived on in American memory from the 1850s through the 1950s and even up into the 21st century, although it's been reimagined recently with new sort of takes. The type of takes that you might find in recent contemporary cinema, being a bit more socially conscious. Nonetheless, this glorification of homesteading also frequently portrays the work of individuals who are of Chinese descent, who are immigrants, who are living in California, some of whom immigrated to California probably before California was a state, when California was part of Mexico, but nonetheless so-called immigrants, who were part of the mining industry and part of the railroad construction industry. What is glossed over, of course, is the fact that it was very difficult for people of Chinese descent living in the Americas to have jobs in any other form of industry as well. What is furthermore glossed over is that, in fact, there are a massive series of Chinese diaspora movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially the late 19th century, from what is then southern Qing China to predominantly Southeast Asia. You have massive cities in Southeast Asia, such as Hatien and also Cholon in what is now Vietnam, which were almost entirely Chinese cities. West coast of peninsular Malaysia, Penang, Ipoh, Putrajaya, and Johor all had very, very large Chinese populations. And in fact, most of the Chinese diaspora from the mainland moved to Southeast Asia. Very, very few people moved to what were then predominantly white settler colonial nations, being Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. But you do see movement of this diaspora. Diaspora included numerous groups, most of which were not Han Chinese. They were mostly ethnic minorities. Yue groups including Taishanese and Cantonese. Taishanese was in fact the most popular language in the United States up through the 1950s, at which point Cantonese replaced Taishanese as the most popular Chinese language. There were also Hakka and various Min groups, Hokkien, Fukienese, Taiwanese, and Teochew. These groups combined in Southeast Asia and began to speak Cantonese as the lingua franca of the Nanyang or the Nanhai Chinese of Southeast Asia. But what is important to remember is that in the case of Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, you do see large numbers of especially male immigrants from this diaspora movement. But let's put two and two together. It was not just economics that caused diaspora. If we have a large number of ethnic minority populations fleeing a country all at the same time, yes, because of the economy, but fleeing a country all at the same time when there's been brutal political repression, perhaps there are other forces at play. And indeed, in this case, there were. Across the Pacific, political elite began to capitalize upon the dynamics of labor and draw upon anti-Chinese sentiment in order to stagnate the progress of the labor movement, especially in the United States. And this was done sometimes with popular cartoons. You could see, for example, the Missouri steamer chasing away a perceived to be Chinese laborer, and although you don't see it on this slide, it's quote within quotes back to China. In the case of the United States, on the cartoon on the right-hand side, you see Chinese laborer who's a dishwasher at the bottom of the slide, and then folks who are indigenous peoples or aborigines in Australia, while there's a stoking of the anger of white folks against the aborigines as well as Chinese in Australia. So this is a very classic sort of class race repression tactic. Divide the working class along lines of race, and then the working class will fight one another rather than their bosses. And this is what happened in these cases in these countries. Now, in the case of the United States, essentially, folks who were of Chinese descent were prohibited by law since 1790 from obtaining U.S. citizenship through naturalization. Folks of Chinese descent who had immigrated to the Americas faced harsh discrimination and violence from predominantly white American settlers in the western United States, despite hardships like a special tax that Chinese miners had to pay to take part in the gold rush, or their subsequent forced relocation into Chinese-only districts. These folks continued to arrive in the United States as immigrants seeking a better life for the families that they had left behind, and trying to bring families to the United States as well. It was only when the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 forbade further immigration from Qing-China for a period of 10 years that the general movement of people stopped directly from China, although there was still some immigration vis-a-vis the Philippines when the Philippines became part of the United States just shortly thereafter, but this was predominantly Filipino Chinese in that case. Furthermore, the new California Constitution of 1879 denied naturalized Chinese citizens the right to vote or to hold state employment, which means no employment in the education industry, no employment in the judiciary, no employment as cleaners for cities, no form of state employment. Additionally, in 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbade further Chinese immigration to the United States for that 10-year period, and the ban was continuously expanded to an Asiatic barred zone in 1917, and continued to be extended on multiple occasions until it was repealed in 1943, but only for Chinese folks in 1943 in mainland China, not in Southeast Asia, and that was predominantly for political reasons during the course of World War II. Nonetheless, in a landmark Supreme Court case, the case of Wong Kim Ark, who is pictured here in 1898, the Supreme Court ruled quite surprisingly that anybody born in the United States, even if their parents were not U.S. citizens, regardless of the immigration status of their parents, anybody born on U.S. soil is eligible for U.S. citizenship, and this has been the case ever since. So here we have a landmark decision asserting the right of folks born of immigrant parents or one immigrant parent on U.S. soil to get U.S. citizenship. So for example, in my case, my father was an immigrant, but I was born on U.S. soil, so I had U.S. citizenship at birth because of that. Now, there's also another category of U.S. citizenship vis-a-vis what's called jus sanguinis, but basically like your parentage as well. So if you have a parent who is already a U.S. citizen, and you're born anywhere in the world, then you also automatically qualify for U.S. citizenship. So this is a very important case. In Wong Kim Ark's case, he was actually born in the United States and then had traveled to Qing, China to visit family, and then the Exclusion Act was passed, and then he attempted to return to the United States, and folks barred him. But you cannot bar a U.S. citizen, no matter what, from entry into the United States, even if they're accused of committing crimes of fraud, and this has come up in some later cases and so forth. U.S. citizens are always guaranteed re-entry. So this is very important in terms of reshaping the United States, but you can see that this occurred during a very contentious period for immigration policy. Nonetheless, Wong Kim Ark deserves quite a fair amount of credit in this case. He stuck it out in the hull of a boat in the harbor off the coast of California throughout this court case, basically living in the brig until the court case was decided and he could finally return home.